Hey Renee, how are you?
I'm good, Magnus. How are you?
I'm good. It's good seeing you again.
It's good to see you.
And I'm excited about this short conversation.
Ditto.
Which I think is going to be about your stay here in Germany in the context of the TURN2 residency program. And it is actually a specific movie that brought you here, which I don't want to spend too much time on because it's a terrible, racist, horrible film. Which actually, and that's probably one of the only beautiful parts about it, sparked a lot of student protests in the 60s when it was screened here in Germany. It's called Addio. And it did spark these student protests also from African students who were studying here in Germany. And you partly came to Germany to sort of like look for these protests and sort of like also for the way they were documented. And you've engaged with different archives here in Germany. And maybe you can start talking about what these encounters look like with these archives and what you found.
Yes, well, the archives that I'm looking at are specific to the protests that happened in August of 1966 over a period of 3 days. And this was one of the first big manifestations of an African student movement, protest movement in Germany. My encounters with the archives have been rather obscure, simply because I don't speak German. And so it's been interesting for me to look through the archives as a non-German speaking person and to find inroads in that respect. And so a lot of my work has been to do with transcription and translation and kind of learning how to read an archive that isn't legible to me immediately. So in some ways intervening with my own body into the archives through the process of translation and finding my own biases and my own prejudices towards what the archive should look like. So I am looking at primary sources, but receiving them as secondary sources because by the time I put them through various different softwares and whatnot, I very much am approaching them as an art avatar inside of this digital space. So that's been a surprising thing. I think very much I thought to encounter them as they existed in the 1960s, but what I'm finding is that I'm reading them in a different frame of with a different frame of reference because my priority at the moment is just to understand them.
Mm-hmm. And what archives here in Berlin specifically did you consult? And what did you find?
We went together to the Landesarchiv.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I have been quite interested in the archive of the DAAD, which is the German International Scholarship Program that has been in existence since the 1920s, that I think has been very much at the forefront of German engagement with a quote-unquote international sphere of knowledge and learning. As well, I've looked at the archives of the Free University of Berlin, and they have comprehensive archives to do with student life throughout the ages. So these are the three archives that I prioritize. Yeah.
And the whole program you're here with in Germany, the TURN2 residency program, is a program specifically designed for curators, emerging curators. And maybe you can also, thinking about like your approach to the archives, talk a little bit about what it means to you as a curator working in archives, working in these German archives, and sort of like coming across these specific student protests.
Right. I mean, it's been interesting to encounter an archive in a Western space and especially a state archive, different state archives, because they have certain privileges, or they have certain priorities in the way that they, in the kind of documentation that they create and the kind of narratives that they propagate. And I come from a heritage where archives are maybe more flexible, more diverse, due to infrastructural circumstances, but also just as a result of like different cultural priorities. And so the archives that I work with in Kenya are more archives within the heritage of orature. And here I'm encountering paper archives on a grander scale, and archives that really privilege authorship in strange ways. For example, we went to the Landesarchiv and realized very quickly that it is difficult to pursuits of copyright and all these different kind of legislations that govern who is able to use the archive and who is able to access the archive have been interesting to see, and those cultural differences are very apparent. And I think this in many ways advises my curatorial approach, or amends my curatorial approach, because a lot of the curatorial work that I do has to do with repatriating knowledge and questions of restitution, but restitution as a way of thinking about justice, as a justice question, rather than a question of moving objects. And so encountering these narratives as objects in the archive is definitely something new for me. And I don't think it's something that I would necessarily have, it's not necessarily an approach that I would have taken in encountering archives back home. So yeah, that's been the one major curatorial difference, I would say. Thinking about knowledge as a tangible thing, as a portable thing, as a thing that requires a certain degree of mobility. And in that respect is also limited by my own access to it. And in Kenya, I feel like I have more liberty to navigate these archives simply because it's my context, simply because I speak multiple languages there. And those archives are very much rooted in, knowledges that live inside of genealogy or inside of people. So yeah, it's different. It's definitely a different encounter, I would say.
And maybe you can elaborate a little more on your understanding of like the way you define a curatorial practice these days as well, because I still think that in a lot of people's heads there's this idea of this one, curator who is up there and like makes choices, and then people who encounter these choices sort of like always relate it back to this one curatorial person, or the person who is like in charge of showing objects or stories or narratives. What do you think about that?
Ooh,
it's a big question. It's a large question.
Yes.
An important one.
I think I'm very resistant to those hierarchies. I think a curatorial practice, first of all, has to be restitutive and restorative. And especially coming from a quote-unquote subaltern context, where we are dealing with questions of coloniality, with questions of a certain kind of racialization of bodies. For me, it's been very important to try and think in counter-canonical ways. And of course, I must admit, I'm myself Western educated, and I came through these institutions that really privilege a certain type of knowledge. So yeah, I think a curatorial approach that is fair, that prioritizes justice, has to be counter-hierarchical, has to be humble, and has to, I don't think that the curator in any respect should be at the forefront of any kind of articulation. As much as curatorial work is important, I don't think it's important that I do it, or I be seen to be doing it, or I be acknowledged to be doing it. I just think it's work that needs to be done because it is work that is justice focused.
And then my final question would be, being part of this exchange program organized by TURN2 Residencies, particularly as a Kenyan, how do you, experience your time here in Germany? And, I'm really asking this question, I guess, also as a German who very well knows about the difficulties this country is facing in terms of its own colonial heritage and histories, and the many resistances that come from various parts of society to deal with that,
yes.
And to deal with their own colonial and racist legacies, Germany's whiteness too. How do you experience this sort of like being part of this larger program that aims to, send curators from the continent, from the African continent to Germany, and then curators working here in Germany to various countries on the African continent? It's not an easy task, it's full of problems, I think, but how do you experience it now as someone who's part of it?
I think for me, it exists very much within the realm of repatriation. So I'm interested in my moment in Germany, yes, in my experiences in Berlin, yes, but really more what this experience will mean for me going back to Kenya. So it is, again, reparative. Like I'm curious about what my communities back home can learn from me having been here. And I recognize very much that I am privileged to be able to circulate in these spaces and to be visible in these spaces. I'm not necessarily concerned with German history, German histories as pertaining to whiteness and racism and whatnot. I don't feel like that's necessarily my work to do. My work is very much that there is something to be gained from experiencing the world and from being in circulation in the world. And there is something that my community at home can gain from this. And in that respect, I very much recognize the privilege of mobility that I have. And I'm always thinking in tandem with collaborators and communities in Kenya to think about like how these knowledges can be better distributed and how these opportunities can be better distributed. So yes, I'm very glad to be in Berlin, but I'm also very much looking back to being in Nairobi and Dakar, which are the cities that I live in, and thinking with people about the encounters that I have here.
And then, and this is really my final question, like how, you were just saying that like you're still in, the process of encountering archives, of gathering various forms of like information and knowledge. What are your hopes, like once you're back and you've looked through stuff, you've worked through these different documents, what are you hoping for?
I hope to create a point of access to these archives because I think that they are important. I mean, the contradiction of working with colonial archives over such a long time is that I'm always encountering like points at which these archives become violent, and they're violent against bodies that look like mine a lot of the time. And so my work has always been to kind of create an intervention so that these archives are legible in a way that is not violent. And I think the story of this protest is a hopeful story. Like you said, this word hope is very pertinent in the way that I'm thinking about the types of knowledge that I'm encountering here, because I really hope that they can reveal a post-colonial moment that was optimistic and euphoric. And I think we've spoken a lot about this figure who's the main figure in the protest, Addio, who I have come to think of as almost like a superhero inside of this story. And in that respect, I'm hopeful to privilege the stories of individuals, to follow the lives of individuals and to follow their influence through the post-colonial period and the kinds of encounters that they had with Germany and that were able to influence their own growth and their own progression as they returned to the African continent and kind of spread this message of Black internationalism and the optimism and the optimism of the post-colonial moment. So yeah, I'm hopeful to uncover stories that are more positive in many respects. And I think the Colonial Archive has a lot to give, as much as it is in its inception problematic. There are things to be seen and to be read. And I'm hoping that this work can make those things legible and possible to repatriate without any of the ruptures that we experience in encountering them when they are presented in their original form, with their original intention. Yeah. So for me, it's a question of intention and slight modification and legibility, and how it might be possible to find a place of solidarity with these movements that were happening in the early 1960s. Because I think that there was method and there is something to be learned from the ways in which these people moved through these spaces. I think that repatriating knowledge can very much be a useful tool for thinking about how to live now and how to interact now, and the kinds of communication that we prioritize in curatorial practice in arts and culture, but also across knowledge systems and the development of different canons and the question of decolonization of language and academia.
Thank you so much, Renée.
Thank you, Magnus.
Dankeschön.
Dankeschön.